And we're back. You're listening to the Exitology Unlock Your Profits, Unlock Your Potential show on the #1 global business talk and news network on the internet, IBGR, International Business Growth Radio, the world of business at your fingertips. Today we are joined by Sean Hutchinson, and he is a founding partner of Ready for Next Advisory Group. And we've been talking this season about creating lasting value, even in a challenging economy. And Sean, a moment ago, shared with us some of the anxieties that the entrepreneur and business owner, particularly over the age of 65, but really the all entrepreneurs and business owners, as they're looking to exit, what they start to experience. And one of the reasons that they experience that, of course, is because you're asking them to do so many things that aren't well-worn patterns in their life. And so Sean, thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit, building on our first segment there, tell us a little bit now, what does it look like? You and I play in complementary spaces in that a lot of manufacturing, a lot of industrial, a lot of those types of blue-collar businesses are multi-generational. And there is a lot that can go wrong and get nasty and weird, quite frankly, in those businesses. And you were sharing something with me. You have a model that creates sustained growth across generations. So maybe you can walk us through that model and a couple examples of how is Ready for Next approaching this situation?
Yeah, so we know that the failure rate on family business transition is very high, right? So by the time you get to the third or fourth generation, you're down in single-digit survival rates, which is a shame. Yep. So we started thinking about how can we move the needle on that? What are the things that need to happen in order for a business to successfully and sustainably transition from one generation to the next, regardless of whether it's first to second, second to third, third to fourth, right? So what are the things that really are in businesses that successfully do that? What have they done well? And we came up with a model called curve spanning. Now it's based on an S curve. I think a lot of people know what an S curve is, right? So you start relatively slow, you go into a high growth phase, and then it kind of tails off at the top of the S. Our position is that the old S curve, or the predecessor generation, is probably by the time you get ready to span to the next generation, that S curve is outdated, most likely. And you have to span to a new S curve that is owned by the successor generation. One of the most damaging, I think, aspects of intergenerational transition is when the predecessor generation insists that the role of the next generation, the successor generation, is custodial only. In other words, we're going to hand the business over to you, but your role is just to keep doing well what we did well in our version of the business. That's damaging psychologically to the next generation. It's also not good for business. We know that from the S-curve methodology. That business is likely to fail. So what are the spans? First of all, you have to span authority. And we all know the stories of the predecessor generation saying, great, generation is going to take over. But when something here starts happening that the predecessors don't like, all of a sudden authority, they start grabbing authority for decision making back. Right?
And I think it might be helpful actually for a moment if we could. Let me check an assumption. My assumption is that most of the first generations that you're dealing with, or the ownership generation right now, would be a baby boomer generation. Is that correct?
Most likely.
Who are they typically, spanning down to, or who are their successors? Is it millennials? Is it Gen X? Is it something else?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the age of the baby boomer, right? So,
all right, fair enough.
If they're the 75, age or 80, I've got a situation now where all three owners are 91, and they think it's too early to do any planning. So,
oh my Lord!
You see these people that are kind of hanging on. That's an indication, right, of them not wanting to span to the next generation. They want to be on the S curve they created, not the new S curve that emerges from it. So you got the spanning of authority, right? Regardless of the generation, and each generation kind of has its aspects, right? It's got different experiences. They think differently. It's fine. And we know that those generational definitions are a little bit arbitrary, but there's some truth to it. We So, you span authority, you also span fealty, what we call spanning fealty, which is a relationship that's been created between the successor generation and their customers and suppliers.
Okay. Yep.
So the loyalty, spanning fealty in these relationships. You have to span knowledge. The predecessor generation knows a lot, but the knowledge that they have may not be as applicable as they think in today's world.
Gotcha.
Let me give you an example. Marketing in today's world is so different than marketing and communications in the world that the baby boomers grew up in. There is literally almost no correlation between the two. So if they say, hey, our marketing knowledge is fantastic, we don't need a website. Yeah, you do actually need a website, right? We don't need a communication for the branding pro. Yeah, actually you do. Otherwise, your is going to blow up. Right?
That's a perfect example. We run into that all the time. And so when we're at Exitology, when we're taking the growth side of the equation and setting people up to go through value acceleration methodology, a big part, we actually have a multi-generational firm who we're working with right now. And, our goal is to grow them by multiple fold over the next 5 years. It took about 4 months for it to get into their head that part of that is going to be a long-term, what we call David versus Goliath SEO strategy, and a long-term, digital marketing presence, full stop. And so that 5 years from now, when the buying public is completely different and it's rolled over into the younger buying public, that they're positioned perfectly for that. And so we see versions of that all the time. One thing I'd be curious to hear you maybe speak to is, what do you do in that situation? Going back to fealty, which is actually a new word in my lexicon as of 3 minutes ago, so thank you. So when you're going through that handoff period of, maybe this gentleman has 80% of the relationships and they've been built up over 30 years, and it's got to be, there's an energetic trust that has to be transferred literally to the next representative over a period of time. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I like the word energy. There is an energetic, generative kind of aspect to it, right? I mean,
for sure,
the transfer has to be a yes and transfer.
Yep.
So my best advice in that area, in the transfer of those relationships, is start really early, right? So prior to the spanning, you probably need to spend 3, 4, 5 years rebuilding and sort of transferring the fealty, the energy that's been built up over 30. You can't transfer the benefit of a 30-year relationship in 5 months.
Right?
You can do it. It's not a legitimate idea. It fails on its merits. So I think thinking about how much work you have to put into that particular area, and also helping the next generation get ready for that kind of relationship. By the way, if you're spanning from one generation to another, your suppliers and vendors probably are, right? They are too. Your customers are too. 2/3 of the businesses out there are owned by baby boomers. So are your customers. So are your suppliers. So you're going to be seeing new generations that connect with one another on another level. They're going through the same thing that you may be going through.
That's actually a really, really good point. Well, you made a lot of really good points there. And one is that starting earlier rather than later, not letting this sneak up on you is super important. We always talk about begin with the end in mind, whatever that is. And you just touched on something that I think is really important, because I think a lot of our clients, and probably yours, I would imagine, have what I would call a pretty long sales cycle. And, like for instance, we have a client who they have one trade show where pretty much all of their business happens. And that trade show only happens every 2 years. Right. So it's like, that's a long sales cycle, right? And, and then there's other ones that happen a lot quicker, but to the point though, if you haven't begun in mind, if you haven't brought your new team, for instance, to the trade show and let them just have that experience, because we all know how learning goes, you're not going to be nearly as good at the first trade show as you are at the second one. Well, if they're
That's
only
right.
happening every 2 years,
Right.
you've got a lot of work to do, right?
That's right. And there's a lot of relationship building, obviously, that needs to happen in between those events, right? The selling event is different than the selling preparation to actually capitalize, right? And leverage that particular event in the most efficient and successful way possible.
Yep.
So starting early. Now, this brings up an interesting question on the S curve, and we talk about this all the time. When is the point on the S curve? What's the best point on the S curve to actually start the spanning? If you wait too long, energetically, you're already at the top of the S curve. The interesting thing about S curves is it may take a long time to get it started and get into the growth phase. It's exponentially faster when it turns the corner at the top. So you may start slowly, but you fail quickly when you get up to that top of the S curve. So you have to start spanning about halfway up the growth curve, right? Which is time, but it's also probably prior to the point where the predecessor generation says, you know what, I think I am ready to let go. They're usually not ready to let go until they're 70 or 75 or maybe even older. So how can they prepare themselves and the successor generation to start that process when the predecessor is 55?
Yep. That's a really good point. It reminds me of the quote of, how did you go bankrupt? Really slowly for a long time and then all at once. And and the same thing, right? Because if you're in that rapid growth part of the S curve, you and I are very philosophically aligned in that the idea is to extend the rapid growth phase as long as practicable,
of course,
because of all of the reasons you just said. You can keep investing into the next generation. You can keep investing into processes, efficiencies, all of the things that make a good business work at that point, as opposed to essentially finding yourself in a turnaround situation.
That's right. Yeah, having waited too long, right? And now everything is reactive rather than strategic. I think, which brings us really to the fourth span, which is assets. And the second generation and the successor generations in a great position because startups would kill for the assets that they're inheriting.
Right.
But there are good assets and bad assets. You don't want to bring the bad ones over. You want to bring the good ones over. And let's
pause with that concept here. We'll be back after a 2-minute break and we'll pick right up on the other side. You're listening to the Eschatology Unlock Your Profits, Unlock Your Potential show.